case of the Armenian Genocide, as mentioned, we, for a while now, have kind of experienced the absence of survivors, where majority of those who actually witnessed the genocide have now passed away. Where now we're living, now we have a generation today where they haven't met, even of Armenians who have never met a survivor. To give you an example, just last week I was in one of our classrooms at our school, and I was asking a group of grade 8 students, so how many of you have met someone who survived the genocide? And none of them had their hand up, which is quite different than my generation, where we all had our grandfathers or grandmothers who survived. And firsthand, we heard stories, especially from those who were prepared or ready to share those stories. And for that generation, one of the challenges in sharing stories, amongst the many challenges that survivors of any genocide experience when they're asked to share, has been the fact that the Armenian Genocide continues to be denied by the state of Turkey, where a lot of survivors experienced and had the fear of experiencing the reality that their stories will be trivialized by individuals who they share them with, who may deny or question their experiences. And it's a second harm that comes after experiencing physically the genocide, is the denial of which is a double killing. Elie Wiesel has identified, where there's the killing, the physical killing, and then there's the denial, which kills the memory of genocide, or those experiences during the genocide. So it's quite a challenging case for the Armenians, where now we're addressing a generation of Armenians who have never met, whereas also now trying to teach a generation of non-Armenians as descendants of survivors, because the survivors themselves are not here today with us. And it has been a challenge. But one of the ways of overcoming that is also combating now also denial. The state-level denial of the Armenian Genocide also brings into question the issue of a state budget that's allocated by the Turkish government to deny the genocide internationally. So Armenian communities now not only have experienced genocide, or are experiencing now the consequences of genocide being dispersed around the world, are now combating a state budget of denial abroad, which has been another challenge in memory, in remembering. The other challenge as well the Armenian community has faced, because of that state-level denial of the Armenian Genocide, is also the absence of sites of memory. So sites where, if in the past the Turkish government, if they were to recognize the genocide, those sites would have become sites of education, sites where people, be it perpetrator group or victim group, or the international community, would have been able to access to learn about the horrors of the Armenian Genocide and learn about not repeating these mistakes. However, these sites that should have become sites of memory had been sites that were destroyed or covered up. For example, and it was kind of relegated to those who kind of saw or remember or saved that history of what happened in those villages, by that lake or by that river, in that gorge. For example, if you're to go to Diyarbakir, in one of the regions in Turkey today, history has been saved there, history that the Armenians abroad don't know, where the local Kurdish communities will be able to tell you that in that gorge, thousands of Armenians were thrown. That site in itself is considered to be a site that is haunted by the memory of the Armenians, and this story was in secret passed down from generation to generation in that community. But that site has been a site where most people had feared to go to, but that history had been kind of covered up. Unless you were an Armenian looking for that site, the history of that site wouldn't have been shared with you. So these sites that should have become those in helping to remember has been now also victimized. One of the most popular sites of memory for the Armenians, for remembrance and for teaching in absence of now, especially the survivors, was also Deir Zor, which was the deserts of Syria, where the Armenians were it was the last point in the genocide where the concentration camps where the Armenians were destroyed en masse in caves and by the rivers and in the rivers. This site in itself, which became kind of an open graveyard for Armenians, was also kind of memorialized as well by building a church and a museum there. But that itself was also victimized shortly before the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide in 2015, where ISIS had kind of taken over Deir Zor and actually destroyed the church where many of the bones and archives were kept, where another site of memory is now inaccessible for the world once again. These are some of the challenges the Armenian community has experienced, which has been difficult in ensuring that, one, the community remembers, second, uses to ensure that others remember as well. And that's where it's important in absence of a surviving generation. I think it's even more important now than ever before to ensure that communities who experience genocide aren't kind of left to commemorate or work towards remembering alone. And that's what's very important, is collective, ensuring that the histories become a part of the collective memory. And that's one of the actions of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, is ensuring that these histories are maintained, or taught, or passed down, and there's a collective memory around it, as was mentioned. And that collective commemoration is also important. So not leaving communities to commemorate or remember alone, but becoming a part of that, especially in cities like Toronto, where many communities should be coming together to remember together. And also, while those survivors are alive, ensuring that people record those stories. We can't take for granted, that survivors are here today. Their stories it's important to salvage and to record and to incorporate. For the Armenians, it was difficult to do that because the surviving generation in itself was a generation that had to organize themselves to now remember and record. So it took a while until survivors brought forth a new generation that was equipped to be able to actually take on that task. There was no Armenian diaspora previous to or no significant Armenian diaspora previous to the genocide. So survivors themselves became a diaspora that had to bring forth a generation that was equipped to actually record those stories. So that's why a lot of the stories that have been recorded, the Shoah Foundation has been instrumental in kind of preserving. You'll see that many of the survivors are in old age, and they're not young. And a lot of those stories were recorded later on, beyond their the primitive years of their survival. And these have been kind of the challenges, but it's important that those stories are preserved from the sort of survivors to share in coming generations, so salvaging those stories. But the number one thing I think across the board with any genocide will experience denial, and I think a collective effort by victims of genocide to combat denial, to ensure that denial isn't affecting the memory of victim groups, is a very important task. I know that many people will probably step in and kind of talk about freedom of speech. However, freedom of speech, in this case, in a case of genocide, which is a transgenerational crime in itself, if you look at the stages of genocide, in Dr. Gregory Stanton's stages, denial is actually part of the crime of genocide. Wherein today, for example, in Turkey, we have the denial that kind of became the discourse, and now we have a Turkish Republic that is working its way through the stages of genocide once again against its minorities, which incorporate also the Armenians and many other groups within Turkey. And denial is being used to kind of silence even Turkish intellectuals. That denial within Turkey has also silenced many histories that were important for both Turks and Armenians, which is a story of people who helped Armenians. Turkish citizens during the genocide who helped Armenians. And these people should have become heroes within Turkey. But they died with that, quote-unquote, the shame of having saved an Armenian. when the Turkish Republic should have made them heroes. And we've lost mutually stories of very heroic acts of Turks during the genocide who saved Armenians. But in fact, what we see within Turkey today is the glorification of the history of those who committed the genocide. So you have streets and schools named after Mehmet Talat, who was the orchestrator of the genocide. So it's troubling to see a country who kind of commemorates or remembers those who committed the genocide by naming schools after them. Whereas the story of those who saved Armenians' lives has gone to the grave. And these are important stories that we should have known, and it's troubling when it comes down to memory.